The first time they saw it, they burst out laughing. Plates of fried dough, covered in sugar. To the German prisoners, it looked like a joke, not breakfast. The mess hall was a long wooden building, bright with the pale sun of a Texas winter morning. Steam rose from metal pots. The air smelled of coffee, oil, and red dust carried in from the yard. A line of prisoners, still in faded gray coats, shuffled forward, tin trays in hand. Ceiling fans turned lazily above them, cutting through the warmth. At the counter stood an American sergeant, broad shoulders, quiet eyes, the look of a man who'd worked in diners before the war. His name tag read Miller. Everyone just called him Cook. He dropped 2 golden rings onto each tray. They glistened in the light, coated in sugar like snow. The laughter started halfway down the line. Fried candy, someone muttered in German. Americans eat like children. Another voice joined in. No wonder they lost so many planes, too much sugar in the fuel. The sound spread, quick, sharp, nervous. For a moment, it was all noise and ridicule. For months they had eaten rations that tasted like metal, canned meat, boiled potatoes, thin coffee. They dreamed of home, dark bread, sausage, the bitterness of real coffee grounds. And now this absurd sweetness, this insult dressed as kindness. Miller didn't react. He kept moving, steady and silent, ladling eggs, pouring coffee, sliding trays down the counter. The laughter rose again, and then he looked up. He didn't shout, didn't even smile. His voice was calm, slow, the kind that cuts through a crowd without trying. Just try it, son. Silence. It spread fast like a wave. Forks stilled, boots shifted on the wooden floor. One man, the one from Hamburg, stared at the warm ring of dough on his tray. Sugar stuck to his fingers. He hesitated, then lifted it to his mouth. Outside, a train whistle moaned across the plains, long and distant. Inside, the sound of chewing was the only thing moving. Then he nodded, just once. The others followed, one by one. A bite, a pause, a look of surprise. And then a low chuckle, not sarcastic this time. Genuine, confused, soft. The air changed. The smell of coffee and sugar mixed with the sun-heated wood of the walls. Someone exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for months. Another man laughed, short and shy, and the room loosened. Beyond the windows, the day was opening. Barbed wire caught the light like glass threads. The fields stretched out in every direction, empty and endless. A guard near the tower lit a cigarette. Somewhere a radio hummed, a country song, a man singing about home and rain. The prisoners kept eating, slowly, carefully, unsure if it was allowed to taste this good. Some smiled. Others stared at their plates as if afraid they'd forget the flavor. One whispered, "They feed us like guests." Another shook his head, "No, like people." Miller leaned against the counter, watching them. His hands were rough, scarred from years at the stove. He thought about his own boy, 20 years old, somewhere in Europe now, maybe hungry, maybe laughing at someone else's food. The man from Hamburg looked up, catching Miller's eyes across the room. For a moment, the two men just stared. No words, no ranks, no uniforms. Only that small, strange understanding of what it means to survive a war you didn't start. A gust of wind rattled the walls. Sugar dust lifted into the air like snow. Someone laughed again, this time full, clean, human. The sound filled the mess hall, echoing against the beams, warm and alive. They thought they were laughing at breakfast. In truth, they were about to taste America itself. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The barbed wire wasn't what shocked us. It was the smiles. The words came from a narrow notebook with cheap paper, written in December 1944 by a junior German NCO, whose name the clerk at the camp misspelled twice. His neat handwriting crowded the margins like he was afraid of wasting space. He listed the date, the weather, clear, cold morning, north wind, and then this line about smiles, underlined once, as if he didn't trust his own eyes. The place was Camp Hearn, Texas, a flat grid of streets burned into sandy soil, guard towers at the corners like sharpened pencils, and barracks long enough to echo. By the time the sun climbed above the mesquite, the camp smelled of soap, dust, and coffee. The mess hall laughter from earlier, the sugar, the warm rings of dough, hung in the air like a rumor and then drifted away on the breeze. Most of them were boys, 18 to 25, captured in Tunisia, Sicily, the hedgerows of Normandy. They came expecting punishment shaped like hunger. Instead, rules that were strict but legible, posted in English and in their own language, a library with dog-eared paperbacks and a stack of German classics donated by a church in Houston, a football field scraped out of the hard ground, a notice board advertising English conversation, beginners, and basic cookery on Thursdays. The barbed wire was real, the towers manned, the rifles loaded. But the faces on the other side were human and tired and, yes, sometimes smiling. A sergeant of the guard, older than the rest, with a jaw that worked when he thought, kept his own notes, pages stained by rain and the edge of his thumbs. They salute us every morning, not from respect, but habit. And we answer, from decency. He wrote that on a Sunday night, the ink wobbling when the wind shook the thin wall of his office. He wasn't sentimental. He called them krauts when the other guards were listening. But he also kept a jar of peppermints in a drawer for the interpreter who coughed in winter. Work details went out after breakfast, cutting brush along the fence, repairing steps on the parade ground, hauling boxes in the quartermaster's store. The MP truck rattled, coughed, kept moving. Conversations rose and fell in two languages that sometimes met in the middle like two hands not sure whether to shake. The town beyond the camp sold fruit pies and cigarettes and new shoelaces. When the prisoners rode past, the schoolchildren stared like they were seeing a traveling circus. Some mothers turned their heads. Others didn't. By afternoon, the library filled with quiet. A young guard posted at the door tried to pronounce titles stacked neatly on a table. Keller, man, remark. He didn't get far. Inside, a prisoner traced a finger under an English sentence from the local paper. Cooler weather expected overnight, and tried the words on his tongue. Another man copied a recipe from a pamphlet the Y served the camp kitchen, mixing English with his mother's notes about yeast. Keep it warm, keep it patient. In the corner, two men argued low over a chessboard made from cardboard squares pinned to a crate, the black pieces whittled from mesquite, the white from bone. It would have been easy to call it humane and stop there. But the place had its own weather. Under the bare bulbs in Barack 7, the crowd's mood thickened and thinned with rumor. One day it was about the Red Cross parcel count, the next about a transfer to another camp in Louisiana, the next about letters that arrived and letters that did not. The crowd began to act like a third, watchful character, reading faces, measuring silence. An insult told once could light the whole room. A joke at the right moment could blow it out like a match. In the late afternoon, the football field drew them, a rough rectangle, chalked by someone who'd watched American games but trusted German rules. Boots scuffed the dirt. A goalkeeper with straw-colored hair strung twine between two stakes and called it a net. Guards leaned on the fence, arms crossed, pretending not to care. The ball moved quickly, the cheers even quicker. For 90 minutes, the war thinned to leather thudding against bone and the small, impossible joy of a shot that curved just right. When a guard clapped once at a clean save, he looked at his own hand as if it had betrayed him. Evening came cool and blue. A projector rattled in the rec hall, the flapping square of light showing a newsreel, maps with arrows, a voice like gravel, the winter offensive in the Ardennes climbing across the screen. Some men watched with their jaws tight. Others looked down at their laps, counting the days on their thumbs. After the newsreel, a comedy short, a skinny man chasing his hat in a windstorm. Got laughs nobody trusted but couldn't help. Back in the barracks, a private unrolled a sheet of onion skin paper and wrote to his mother in Bremen. We rise early. The coffee is weak. There is sun even in winter. They have a library. I read a little. He paused, then added, people here say, sir, even to strangers. He almost crossed it out. He didn't. In the guard shack, the sergeant who kept notes drew a small map of the compound on a scrap envelope, marking the places where fights tended to start, the wash line, the card table, the stove when the temperature dropped. He wrote beside it, watch the ones who never laugh. He knew crowds. He had worked stockyards before the war, knew when cattle moved because they were told and when they moved because they were scared. The sound was different. Thursday's cooking lesson smelled like onions and flour. The American instructor, a balding man who said he'd never expected to teach his grandmother's soup to prisoners, showed them the trick with the roux. Slow, constant, patient, like mending a shirt. He spoke. The interpreter repeated, hands did the rest. A boy from Swabia tasted from the spoon and swallowed too fast, burning his tongue. He swore softly and then grinned. A small, startled flash of the child he'd been before uniforms and railcars. All week the smiles kept showing up where nobody expected them. In line at the commissary window. In the library when someone found a book from home. At the fence when a mockingbird perched and sang until the guard on the tower forgot to shift his weight. The barbed wire did not soften, but something in the air did. The crowd, always listening, heard something else too. New boots in the yard. A truck that came late and left early. A rumor about a transfer list that did not include names everyone assumed it would. The map on the guard's envelope gained a pencil dot by the gate. The junior NCO's notebook added a line he did not underline. Our habits are returning. We stand straighter. We speak softer. We remember ourselves. They slept light that night, the barracks breathing in unison, boards settling in the cool. The projector was dark, the football field empty, the mess hall wiped down and quiet. Somewhere a dog barked 3 times and then quit. By week's end, somebody would step across an invisible line and learn what freedom tastes like in a place built to deny it. The smell hit first, sugar and hot oil, braided with coffee and dust. A guard at the door breathed in and said it smelled like home. The prisoners didn't agree. They called it madness under their breath, staring at the golden rings cooling on the racks beside the stove. Sunday morning. The mess hall bright and hot, windows fogged, the ceiling fan ticking lazily. Sergeant Miller, the camp cook, moved with quiet precision. He'd been up since dawn, rolling dough, watching the oil. A diner man before the war, he treated breakfast like a ceremony. Trays clattered. Boots scraped. The line moved forward, gray coats brushing shoulders. Some of the men whispered that Americans were fools, dessert for breakfast. Others laughed, thin and sharp. Miller slid eggs, poured coffee, then dropped 2 warm rings onto each tray. Sugar hissed where it met grease. The air filled with a smell both comforting and absurd. Halfway down the line, one man lifted his portion with 2 fingers. I'm a soldier, he said in German. Not a child. The laughter grew. Miller didn't answer right away. When he did, his tone was calm. Eat first. Decide after. The line went still. Outside, a train whistle cut the wind. The man hesitated, then bit in. He chewed once, twice. His face changed, just slightly, a muscle near his jaw twitching. Then another bite, slower. The others watched, uncertain. A few followed. Someone muttered, Mein Gott, it's warm inside. Another laughed, short, embarrassed. Then, almost without noticing, the room softened. Plates filled. Coffee was sipped. The sound of utensils replaced the tension. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't feel like a border. Miller leaned against the counter, wiping his hands. He watched the faces. Boys, really, some still with dust from Africa on their boots. Their laughter turned genuine now, lighter. He thought of his own son, somewhere in France, maybe eating cold rations. A guard by the door noted something in his pocketbook. They're quieter when fed well. He didn't know if that was mercy or strategy. The morning light shifted through the high windows, falling across the tables. Beyond the barbed wire, the fields shimmered pale yellow. A mockingbird perched on the fence, its song threading through the hum of conversation. One prisoner broke his donut in half and passed the rest to the man behind him without looking. Small kindnesses multiplied quietly, unnoticed by the guards. Another wiped sugar from his lip and whispered, They feed us like guests. The man beside him shook his head. No, like people. The line of men became a single rhythm, chewing, murmuring, breathing. The laughter grew again, real now, filling the room. Miller didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched. For a few minutes, the war felt far away. Then a corporal entered, boots sharp on the floorboards. He carried a folded list. Work detail, he said. The laughter faded as names were read aloud. The tall man who'd mocked the food stood first, his tray still half full. One by one, others followed. The guard at the door closed his notebook. Outside, the truck engine coughed, ready. Inside, sugar glittered on the tables like frost. The remaining men ate in silence. The taste of sweetness lingered, strange, almost guilty. They didn't understand why it made their chests tighten. The tall man glanced back once before stepping out. Miller met his eyes across the room. No words, just that brief connection. Two men who knew hunger in different uniforms. The door shut. Dust settled. Someone exhaled shakily. The sound of laughter was gone now, replaced by the low hum of memory. They had thought they were laughing at breakfast. In truth, they were tasting something they couldn't yet name, a kind of freedom wrapped in sugar and heat. And before the day was over, that taste would come back to haunt them. They said it was just sugar and flour. But that morning, it felt like something sacred. The mess hall was quiet now, heavy with the echo of laughter that had burned itself out. Plates clinked softly as the last of the coffee cooled. The smell of fried dough still floated in the air, sweet and stubborn, clinging to the rafters like memory. The Americans had started clearing tables, trays stacked, rags dragging through puddles of coffee, but the prisoners didn't move. They sat where they were, staring at empty tin plates, hands folded, as if leaving too soon might break whatever spell had settled over the room. Outside, the wind stirred the red Texas dust, scattering it across the yard. Somewhere, a hammer struck metal, the sound of a camp resuming its rhythm. But inside, time felt slower. The noise of war, the shouts, the boots, all of it belonged to another world. Here, the only sound was the soft scrape of a broom and the hollow hum of the ceiling fan. Hans Müller, a stocky man with the shoulders of a baker and the eyes of someone older than his years, looked up. His English was careful, measured. In Germany, he said, his accent thick but steady, sugar was for children. He paused, tapping his spoon against the edge of his tray. Here, even men are allowed to be human. The sentence hung in the air. A few of the guards turned their heads, not sure if they'd heard him right. Then one of them, Sergeant Thomas Blake, the man who had been serving that morning, set down his rag. He didn't speak, but something in his face shifted, a tiny crease between the eyebrows, as if the words had landed somewhere deep. Later, in the camp's daily report, an officer typed the line without much thought. Morale improved significantly after introduction of cultural exchanges and shared meals. A bureaucratic phrase, thin as paper. But between those words, the truth was thicker, a silence that meant more than rules or rations ever could. The prisoners didn't leave until the guards told them twice. Even then, they moved slowly, careful not to disturb the sugar dust that shimmered on the tables. When they stepped outside, the sun hit their faces hard, the kind of heat that bleaches color from everything. They squinted, covering their eyes with the same hands that, an hour earlier, had held warm donuts. Sergeant Blake stayed behind. He wiped down the last counter, rinsed the cups, turned off the coffee burner. Then, leaning against the sink, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a scrap of stationery. The pencil lead was dull, the paper creased from too many folds. He began writing to his wife back home in Kansas. You'd think fried dough couldn't end a war, he wrote. But for a moment it did. He stared at the line for a while, unsure if he should cross it out. Instead, he drew a small star beside it, the way he always did when he wanted her to pay attention. The light through the window shifted again, washing the walls in gold. A tin plate on the table gleamed like a metal no one wanted. The air had that fragile stillness of a place that's just been forgiven for something. Outside, the men from Barrack 6 walked back toward the yard in loose lines. Their boots stirred small clouds of dust, which hung in the air long after they'd passed. The guards watched from the shade, rifles slung low, the tension thinner now, almost gone. Hans Müller walked at the back, slower than the rest. He carried his empty cup in one hand, turning it absently, like he was still thinking about the taste that didn't belong in a prison camp. When he reached the fence, he stopped and looked toward the guard tower. The man inside, young, sweating, bored, met his eyes. Neither moved. Then Müller lifted the cup slightly, a gesture somewhere between salute and thanks. The guard hesitated, then nodded once. In the distance, the sound of the camp generator stuttered and caught again. Voices rose near the laundry, laughter from the American cooks echoing faintly through the yard. It felt different now, not sharp, not mocking, just tired men laughing because they could. Back inside the mess hall, Sergeant Blake folded his letter, slid it into an envelope, and pressed it flat. The corner tore, just a little. He didn't mind. He added a single sentence at the bottom. Maybe decency isn't a victory, but it's something close. He sealed the letter and left it on the counter for the mail truck. When he turned to leave, he noticed one of the prisoners' trays still sitting on the far table. On it, a single half-eaten donut, The sugar melted into a dark patch where fingers had pressed too long. Blake stood over it for a moment, then smiled faintly and took a bite. Outside, the air had cooled. The sun was sinking behind the towers, and the wire shadows stretched long across the dirt. The prisoners had returned to their barracks, but through the open windows, their low voices drifted, talking, humming, a wordless rhythm that carried farther than the guards expected. At the edge of the compound, by the kitchen door, Muller appeared again. He waited until Blake looked up from sweeping. The German held out a small, worn notebook, the kind they all carried, filled with ration numbers, addresses, memories. He flipped to a blank page, tore it out carefully, and handed it over. Then he pointed to the counter, to the mixing bowl still dusted with flour. Blake frowned, confused for a second. Then he understood. He smiled, not wide, just enough to show the lines around his eyes. He picked up a pencil stub from the table, drew a small circle, and wrote 2 words beneath it. When Muller took the page, his hand trembled slightly. He looked down at the words, then back up at the American, who only shrugged and turned away to hang his apron. The German folded the paper, slid it into his breast pocket, and walked toward the yard without another word. The page crinkled softly as he moved, a small, secret sound beneath the wind. And when one of them asked for the recipe, the guard didn't hesitate. He tore a page from his notebook, drew a circle, and wrote just 2 words. Yeast. Patience. That was all. No measurements, no times, no secrets, only a shape and an idea. But to the men behind the wire, it was enough. The rumor spread by noon. The American gave a recipe. It passed from barack to barack, changing slightly each time. By evening, every prisoner seemed to know. The guards were teaching them how to make the sweet rings. Some said it was a trick, a joke. Others said it was permission. Hans Muller took it seriously. He had been a baker before the war, his hands built for kneading, his memory full of smells, rye, yeast, burnt crust. That night, he sat on his bunk under the low bulb and copied the words again and again in his notebook until the page was soft from the pencil. The next morning, he went to the wire and asked to speak to the kitchen sergeant. The guard on duty laughed. You want to bake? Yes, Muller said simply. For the men. After a pause that stretched too long, the guard waved him through. All right, but if you burn it, you eat it. The kitchen felt strange to him. American tools, American smells, but the same heat he'd known all his life. The other prisoners watched from the door, whispering. A few of them joined in, measuring flour with tin cups, stirring water in battered pots. Their movements were awkward at first, like men remembering a forgotten dance. Miller, the head cook, leaned on the counter, pretending not to supervise. You'll need it warm, he said quietly, not hot. I know, Muller answered. Patience, Miller added. Yes, the German said, smiling faintly. Patience. The dough rose faster than they expected. Too fast. The air in Texas was dry, restless. The men argued over whether to wait or fry. Muller pressed a finger into the surface and felt the bounce. Now, he decided. The oil hissed. Someone flinched. Someone else laughed. A ring slipped from the fork, tumbled into the sand, and they roared louder. But the laughter was different this time. Not sharp, not guarded. The guards near the door joined in. For once, there was no line between uniforms. One by one, the golden circles appeared, floating, spinning, then sinking into color. The smell climbed through the open window, drifting toward the yard where the others waited. Heads turned. Men leaned forward, drawn by instinct, by memory. When the first batch cooled, Muller dusted them with what little sugar they had. Rationed, precious. He stood back, arms crossed, uncertain. The Americans looked at the tray, then at him. The air between them felt electric, fragile. Miller broke the silence. Smells right, he said. Muller nodded once. Maybe too little sugar. The guard beside him chuckled. We'll see. For a long moment, no one moved. The oil still whispered on the stove. The dough steamed in the cool air. Everyone waited. Prisoners, guards, cooks, unsure who should taste first. One of the younger Americans reached out, then hesitated. His hand hovered above the tray, then dropped to his side. You first, he said. Muller looked down at the food he'd made from another man's recipe. He thought of his wife, his small bakery, the smell of flour at dawn before the sirens came. He thought of the notebook page folded in his pocket. He lifted one ring, warm, delicate, trembling in his hand. For once, someone murmured, "The only thing between them is oil and dough." And in that suspended moment, between the hiss of the pan and the breath of the crowd, no one could tell which side of the wire they stood on. The guard took one, bit it in half, and smiled. "Not bad," he said, thumb catching a streak of sugar. The German baker grinned, breath shallow with relief. "Next time, more sugar." Evening settled along the fence line in long, copper bands. Heat leaked from the day but held in the kitchen walls, turning the air soft and edible. The oil's whisper had quieted to a memory in the pan. Outside, boots scuffed the dust as men drifted closer, pulled by the smell the way tide follows the moon. The tray came out to the yard, and for a brief, impossible span, there were no sides to the world, only hands reaching and then, politely, yielding. "You first, no you." A ring found a guard's palm, still warm. Another found the boy from Swabia, who lifted it to his face and closed his eyes before tasting, as if he were praying. Voices rose without sharp edges. Barbed wire cut the sunset into neat strips, but the light slid through anyway. Someone laughed and startled himself with the sound. "It smells like Sunday morning before the war," a prisoner said, almost apologizing to the air. "That's what we're fighting for," the American answered, no swagger in it, just a tired truth placed gently on the table between them. The tray passed again. Sugar dust clung to knuckles and cuff buttons. A harmonica appeared from some impossible pocket. 2 low notes wavered, then steadied. No song anyone could name, just a path back to breath. In the tower, the sentinel shifted, rifle slung, eyes soft in the last light. He could see mouths moving but not the words. He did not need them. Inside the admin hut, an officer filled out the daily report. He paused over a blank line and wrote, "They baked, we watched." For a moment, we were all just men trying to remember peace. He didn't show it to anyone. He simply blew on the ink, blotted it, and felt older than his years. Near the kitchen door, Hans Muller stood with Miller, the camp cook, shoulder to shoulder like apprentices who had long since forgotten who taught whom. They spoke in half-words and gestures, a pinch, a longer rise, the lift of the oil when it's ready. Miller tapped the thermometer and said, "Listen." Muller nodded. He'd always trusted sound. Dough sighing under a palm, loaves cracking as they cooled. Across the yard, the mockingbird from the morning tried a scrap of the harmonica's tune, failed, and tried again. A second batch came out darker, impatient. The third landed just right. The Americans teased the Germans for their thin sugar hand. The Germans teased the Americans for the coffee that could hold a nail upright. The crowd, that third creature who had learned suspicion as a second language, leaned inward and, just this once, set it down. You could feel the release in small, bodily ways, a shoulder dropping, a jaw unclenching, the way men stood with their feet no longer aligned for departure. A man who had not spoken in weeks took a ring, broke it neatly, shared it with the stranger beside him, then looked surprised by his own hands. Another folded a paper napkin around his portion and slipped it into his pocket, as if saving proof for a future that might not believe him. The guard with the notebook wrote nothing. Sometimes the only accurate record is silence. Dusk thickened. The yard's hard edges softened into shapes. In the barracks, someone lifted a pot lid to check the evening stew and forgot to put it back, letting steam wander into the last light. From the chapel hut came a chord on an out-of-tune piano, and then, almost shyly, a hymn that crossed languages without asking permission. Men did not sing the words. They hummed the distance between them until it felt smaller. Miller leaned closer to the German baker. "You'll sleep tonight," he said. "Maybe for the first time," Muller answered, and meant the first time in years. He rubbed at a burn on his wrist he hadn't noticed in the heat of the work. The pain arrived late and honest. They stood that way, cooks without a kitchen's walls, watching what they had made move through a crowd that had forgotten how to pass gentleness along. The harmonica found a harmony. The tower light clicked on, pale and insect-bright, cutting a neat cone across the yard. No one flinched this time. Later, scraps of conversation would be written down in different hands and inks. It tasted like the bakery on Markstrasse. It tasted like the Midway in July. It tasted like a door you didn't know was locked until it opened. The officer would underline a single phrase in his own ledger. Men stood without bracing. That, more than anything, felt like news. Night took the color from faces, left only shapes and breath. The last tray returned to the kitchen empty except for crumbs that winked like tiny coals. Someone began sweeping as if that, too, were a sacrament. When the broom paused, you could hear crickets stitch the fence line to the field, the faint clink of cups being stacked, the faraway train reminding everyone that places existed beyond this grid of streets and wire. The mess hall door swung shut with a soft, satisfied thud. In the barracks, the usual arguments thinned to murmurs and then to the slow, even tide of men giving up the day. A few wrote letters by low bulb. We cooked. One began, then scratched it out and tried again. We remembered. The paper drank the word. That night, behind barbed wire, they did not feel like enemies. They just felt full. And a few days later, when the wire remembered its purpose and the world barged back in, they would learn the cruel mathematics of mercy. Once you taste freedom, you cannot unknow its flavor. They were prisoners, but they wrote home like tourists. Winter laid a thin, chalky light over the barracks. In the mornings the yard froze just enough to crunch, and by noon the sun turned everything back to dust. The Red Cross crate came to the admin hut twice a week, and with it the permission the men had been waiting for. One letter, one postcard. The American clerk slid out the pale forms stamped Kriegsgefangenen-Post, the ink already brown from cheap paper. There were boxes for name, rank, number, a narrow field for camp, Hearne, Texas. Lines ran tight and unforgiving, as if feelings had to learn to walk heel-to-toe to fit. They didn't mention the towers. Not the schedules, not the orders barked in a voice that came from nobody's home village. They wrote about weather, about a mockingbird that refused to migrate, about a library that smelled faintly of soap. And over, they wrote about donuts. Americans eat like children. One man wrote in a careful school hand, each letter its own small room. Sweet, warm, careless. And maybe that's why they'll win. He stopped, stared through the window toward the kitchen, and underlined warm as if the word could travel across the Atlantic and keep somebody's hands from stiffening. Another began. I laughed when they offered sugar. He paused long enough that the ink haloed on the page, then added, now I laugh at what we believed about them. He didn't cross anything out. He let the sentence stand, a plank laid over a river he hadn't known he could cross. The room of writers sounded like a hive, chairs scooting, pencils scratching, the mutter of dates and street names. A guard made slow rounds between tables, glancing at pages not to read them, but to keep time. He'd been told not to interfere unless a man wrote troop positions or drew maps. Nobody drew maps. They drew circles like halos and called them dough. Outside, breath rose in white threads. Inside, paper scuffed under palms that had learned, too quickly, how to obey. When a sentence crowded the margin, the writer didn't tear the sheet and start again. He squeezed the words smaller, like packing a trunk for a trip no one had chosen. They reached for cliches and found food instead. They reached for anger and found appetite, and then confusion that shame had been replaced by hunger so fast. Hans Muller bent low over his postcard, his body remembering the stance of a baker checking an oven. He printed in block forms so the censors could glide. I am in good health. We work some. I read Goethe in a small library. On Sunday mornings, they brought fried dough with sugar. He glanced toward the stove that had been his stage 2 nights before and added one more line. Unadorned. A decent enemy is not the same as a friend, but it is not the same as a monster, either. The American clerk stamped each card with a rubber seal that thunked like a heartbeat, passed by camp censor. The ink bled through. Then a second stamp in purple, prisoner of war mail, no postage necessary. The stack looked official enough to be harmless, and dangerous for precisely that reason. A boy from Swabia borrowed words from the English class and folded them into German like egg whites. The cook says patience. He is right. A mechanic described the sound of hot oil as soft rain. A farmer wrote only, they let us eat until we remembered home, then left the rest of the card blank, as if he'd said too much already. The crowd, that third, silent character, changed while they wrote. In the mess hall, they had leaned forward, bodies greedy for sweetness. Here, they leaned inward, greedy for precision. They argued over whether Krapfen was the right word, whether Berliner would sound too city, whether Fettgebäck was honest but ugly. In the end, They chose donut because it felt like an object that belonged to the present rather than the past. When the bells sounded for mail collection, jaws tightened the way they did on parade. Each man held his letter like a fragile tool. The line moved toward the window. The guard at the bin took them with 2 fingers, delicately, almost polite, and stacked them in a crate whose corners had been mended with tin. The crate went to a truck that went to a depot that went to a train that crossed hours of winter and cotton and rumor. They watched it leave and then pretended not to, in the way men pretend not to watch luck. Nights were loud with quiet. Pages rustled under blankets where men rewrote what they would write next week, rehearsing the part of themselves they wanted to ship overseas. In a corner bunk, a corporal drafted a letter he would never send. I have begun to suspect that freedom is not a flag but a table with enough chairs. He tore it up and slept badly over the scraps. The Americans wrote, too, though not as many and with less ceremony. A sergeant in the guardhouse tried to explain it to his sister. I keep handing them sugar and getting back silence that isn't empty. He didn't expect an answer. It snowed once, briefly, flakes dissolving as soon as they met anything warm. The men cheered anyway, because cheering was a way to turn weather into proof. They stood at the windows, laughing like boys caught in a harmless storm. Afterward, in the steam of the mess line, a prisoner joked that even Texas understood how to sift sugar if it tried. By February, a rhythm had set in. Work, study, game, letter. The kitchen smelled of coffee even when it was only water tinted by memory. The library's lending ledger filled with careful signatures. On the notice board, someone pinned a clipping from a Houston paper about a bake sale for the war effort. The headline used the word victory beside the word cake without irony, and that, too, made men smile in ways they didn't report. Then came the postcard that did not look different and was different all the same. Addressed to a tenement near the port in Hamburg, written in the same neat hand as hundreds of others, it carried no map, no complaint, no names of officers. It carried a sentence that would sound, in a room far away, like something else. They give us sweet rings on Sundays. Warm. We laugh with them now. The card took its route the way water takes a riverbed worn long before it. Censor marks stacked like small bruises. American, Red Cross, Transit Office in Lisbon, a German stamp in gray-blue that said Jeppert. It landed in a bag with others, the cord drawn tight. Weeks later, in a city cracked by winter and news, a hand that did not belong to the addressee lifted the card from the stack. The fingers were official, practiced at finding wrong shapes in right words. They read the line about sweet rings, about warmth, about laughter that had changed its target. They turned the card over and saw nothing but the return address of a camp whose name meant nothing and everything. And somewhere between the stamp and the desk blotter, the ordinary letter stopped being private. The consequences started walking toward it on quiet shoes. When the Gestapo opened the letter, they thought it was code. A junior clerk in a gray office on Steinstrasse turned the postcard in his fingers, reading the line twice. They give us sweet rings on Sundays. Warm. We laugh with them now. He underlined warm and laugh with the hard edge of a ruler, then slid the card into a manila folder stamped Spécialisé, parfum. Dough as cipher, sugar as signal. What else could sweet rings mean if not something hidden? He wrote in the margin, brisk and dismissive, likely allied deception. The file thickened by afternoon. Other intercepted mail was pasted in with brittle glue, a note about a library, a mention of conversation classes, a sketch of a football pitch behind wire. A typed cover sheet concluded, certain prisoners describe high morale and excessive freedom in American camps. Someone in the chain added in pencil, unreliable. Exaggerations induced by enemy promises. The last word was pressed so hard it dented the page below. Propaganda needed straight lines. The home broadcast said the Americans starved captives, worked them like mules, kept them in cages. A pamphlet, printed on poor paper, warned, no soldier should think the enemy is human. The ink bled, the idea did not. To admit otherwise would loosen a seam no speech could mend. Across an ocean, a different file fattened. In Washington, a staff captain with a white coffee ring on his blotter stapled together reports from Hearn, Tonkawa, Lord's book. He highlighted a paragraph for a general whose signature looked like a picket fence. Good treatment of POWs undermines enemy morale more than any weapon. The sentence carried no music, only weight. A note in the margin read, "Circulate to War Department Public Relations. Do not publish specifics." Mercy, kept quiet, traveled farther. Back in the Texas camp, no one knew about the folders. They knew the clock, the trucks, the way winter light fell differently after rain. They knew the shape of the donuts in their hands and how the crowd had learned to laugh without looking over its shoulder first. The kitchen carried on, its hours indifferent to strategy. Yeast. Patience. The recipe worked on men as surely as on dough. In Berlin, a meeting room fogged with cigarette smoke debated the postcards as if they were balloons to be popped. American trickery. Impossible. Investigate. An officer asked whether references to sweetness might conceal grid coordinates or unit numbers. Another, less certain in his uniform than his hunger, said quietly that perhaps the message was literal. The room fell on him, efficient as a trap. Minutes recorded none of it. Only, conclusion, correspondence evidences enemy psychological operations. Monitor. Punish indiscretion. Punishment landed where it always did. Not on the talker, but the listener. A woman in Hamburg was called in and asked why her husband would write such things. She didn't know. She said he had worked with flour his whole life. He would notice sweetness anywhere. The officer wrote, stubborn. He meant dangerous. The postcard, stripped of its domestic destination, was filed among maps, cables, ration tables, small, human warmth preserved in a drawer that never opened to sunlight. It sat there like a coal that refused to die. What had begun as a joke about childish breakfast now bent the air on both sides of the war. A kitchen gesture, handing over a warm ring, was recast as doctrine and then as threat. The men in Herne felt the repercussion not as orders, but as a new caution in the guards' voices, a slight tightening of schedules, a reminder at roll call to keep letters brief and factual. The harmonica still found its notes, but softer, the mockingbird sang, and a tower light clicked on a minute earlier. Even so, the reports kept agreeing with what the mouth already knew. Decency was a solvent. It got under paint. It lifted slogans. A camp chaplain wrote, in the tidy script of a man who believed in records, they line up with better posture after a good meal. Less swearing, fewer fights. A man who has eaten is harder to turn back into a weapon. He sent it up the chain. It disappeared into a binder and out of history. When spring crept in, the folders in Berlin grew thin, not because the letters stopped, but because the mailbags did. The folders in Washington thickened again with photographs of smiling work details and typed praise that carefully omitted names. Somewhere between the two, a truth persisted that neither file could quite hold, the way a hand offering sugar could make an oath crack. By April, the word capitulation began to leak from radios like steam from a kettle. In one office, a stamp was reapportioned from Prüfung to Archiv. In another, a colonel signed a memo and went home to dinner. And in Texas, men slept lighter, as if their bodies expected a door to open. When the war ended, files would be boxed and shipped to basements. Arguments would become footnotes. But not everything would stay in the archive. A few of those enemies, mailed and stamped and counted for so long, would trace the path of their own letters in reverse, across water, through dust, until the kitchen light at dawn looked familiar again. And when the war ended, some of them would come back to America, not as prisoners. April 1945. The guards brought coffee. No rifles, no orders. Just the thin clink of cups and the smell of fried dough rising into a morning that felt emptied out, like a room after a long argument. The radio in the admin hut rasped through static, then spoke the word no voice could make large enough. Capitulation. Men stopped moving, as if the air had turned thick. No cheers. No fist in the air. Only a silence you had to walk around. In the mess hall, the stove was already hot. Miller worked without hurry, the way a man sets a table for a guest who might not arrive. Flour on his hands, coffee on the boil, dough turned out and rolled, cut and lifted. A guard carried the tray to a long table and set it down like a book being closed. Around the room, faces that had learned to pretend neutrality faltered and showed their years. An American sergeant and a German officer stood side by side, elbows almost touching, both men newly unarmed in ways that had nothing to do with weapons. No more enemies, huh? The American said, not smiling. No more sugar either, the German answered, and then they both laughed, quietly, like men surprised to find their mouths still knew how. Letters lay open on a few tables, last pages folded back, dates circled, sentences crossed out and rewritten for a future that had changed overnight. Hans Muller held his cup in two hands to stop the tremor. He took a donut and bit carefully, like honoring a ritual. "I came here hating them," he said to no one in particular. "I leave knowing I never really knew freedom until now." He wiped sugar from his lip with the back of his hand, as if to prove it had happened. Outside, the towers were still there, but different, props on a stage where the play had ended and the audience had already put on their coats. The wire hummed in the breeze without meaning. A train sounded far off, not urgent, merely punctual. Men stood in small knots and talked about trains, ships, farms, daughters, nothing that could be ordered into columns. Miller handed out seconds. He did not keep any for himself until the room had found its pace. When he finally sat, he looked across at Muller and lifted his cup. No toast, just a gesture that said, "We did what we could." The chaplain wrote a single line in the daybook: "Coffee, donuts, news. No disturbances," then closed it and put his hand on the cover as if to bless paper. The officer who had once underlined a sentence about peace without showing it to anyone stood by the door and watched men leave in twos and threes, slower than they had entered, each carrying a shape of this morning he would not be able to explain at home. By noon the radio was quiet again. The last tray came back to the kitchen with only sugar crystals winking in the light. Someone swept. Someone opened a window. Warm air slipped through the screen and took the smell with it, out over the wire, toward the fields. Sometimes the smallest things change the course of hearts. Not speeches, not bombs, just breakfast. They arrived as enemies and left with the taste of America on their lips.